So what my problem is a little different than what we've seen so far. What I've been working on for the last few years is I'm an engineer. I work on devices, mobile devices, as well as embedded devices. And one of the things that I've been looking into is to do classification on gestures. Like, you have a device with an IMU, an initial motion unit, like an accelerometer or gyroscope, or a combination of the two, and trying to essentially determine what gesture is being done based on that. So I thought that this would be a good opportunity for me to practice some of that. You'll see through my presentation that what I ended up doing is spending a lot of time on the data collection and data processing or data cleaning side of the work, and just a little bit of time on the actual deep learning part for a couple of surprising reasons. So this is my presentation, and I'll switch back and forth between this and the and another other things. Oops. Okay. So what I used for this is I used a microcontroller device which has a chip that essentially allows me to send data over Bluetooth, and I'm in this case using Bluetooth Classic connected to my PC, and an accelerometer, gyroscope. This device, the MPU 9250, which is an IMU, and then I basically combined the two into this contraption that captures the motion and sends it to my computer. And then this is essentially how I mounted it on my wrist, with a glove and so forth. In terms of the gestures, so I gave this a lot of thought, and I ended up with 8 gestures or 8 classes. And they were basically a combination of a couple of interests that I had. So one of them would just be like, regular motion, like waving, the OK sign, the stop sign, and the thumbs up. And I have to say that these are basically dynamic gestures. In other words, the OK is not just a static OK, it's the actual emphasis with the OK, the stop with the, with the hand motion and so forth, so that there's more data captured or variation between them. And then the other interest was in terms of, some martial arts, in this case, boxing, and I captured a jab strike, a hook, and an uppercut, just to kind of mix it up. And what you see on the right here is what the accelerometer looks like, the X, Y, and Z, as well as the magnitude looks like on in the capture device. And even though those gestures are fairly different, you can see that there's some similarities in the graphs, but maybe some subtle differences. And the hope was that the deep learning tool would basically pick it up and tell them apart. So what does the data look like? So essentially, as I said, I'm capturing the data from this IMU, sending it to my computer. So on the left side, you see what the data looks like on this tool called TerraTerm. You have a timestamp, the X value, the Y value, and the Z value. I only focused on the accelerometer, and then this is what it looks like, if I graph it. And I actually like to show you. Oops, I'd like to show you what it looks like in real life. Can you see this? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can. Okay, great. So I'm just gonna reconnect to the data. Yeah. Okay, well, that's not working. Good thing I had a screenshot, so I'll just me give it one more try. All right, that's not working. Let's switch back. Can you see my PowerPoint?
No, it's
I still see the data on the console.
I'm going to try avoid to switch back and forth as much as possible. Okay. So anyway, so data is being collected. And so I quickly find out that I had a big problem in that the tool that I was using is sending data essentially, it's sending data and it's coming down, if you picture it vertically, right? So you have here XYZ, XYZ coming in. You know, in the CSV, I put the class in. So at first I put just letters like hook and wave, etc. But then I ended up basically assigning a number to that, and that's you know, important, of course, for the model classification. So I ended up with, as I said, 8 classes, collected 50 to 55 samples for each class. So this is me, you know, spending, you know, about an hour, you know, punching and doing hand gestures. And then the problem that I discovered, of course, is that now I have to actually format it so that the model can actually understand it. And as far as I understand, the model has to have the classes, essentially each sample has to go horizontally like this. And so I ended up spending some time converting you know, this data here into this format over here. So same data, it just had to be reformatted. And I have the class at the very end of the very last series in the data frame is the actual classes. So let me show you how I did that. Okay, so here, basically I'm, you know, doing the regular imports. I have this file called gesture data reformatted. Oh, which I actually did in a different notebook. So sorry about that. So I basically took the original CSV and then converted it into this format, and I just verified that that it has the right format. One thing I noticed is that it added this column here, this series here, NB. So I basically dropped it, removed it, and then now I had this basically the clean data that I was looking for. Here's just me doing a bunch of checks to make sure that the number of columns is correct. And then eventually splitting the data between training and data set and test sets. Doing some scaling, you know, picked that up, I think, from the class, and also just some reading. You know, my data goes from 0 to 123, which is essentially 10-bit numbers coming from the IMU. And so here I just did some rescaling so that you know, it was the numbers were a little, you know, smaller, better to deal with. And then here's, we're building the model. And so since I spent so much time building, you know, collecting the data and doing the data processing, I had very little time left for the actual modeling, but fortunately, you know, this is something that could be modeled very quickly. And I initially went with dense model that had 2 hidden layers. And what I realized on the first run is that the classification went to 100% really quickly. Originally, I had, I believe, 100 units, 100 units for the first layer, 64 units for the second layer, and it went really quick to 100%, which actually surprised me because I thought, 8 classes, it's, quite a bit of data. But then in hindsight, looking at the actual gestures, what you'll notice is that the axis on like the Z, the Y, and the X for each one of these gestures is pretty different. If you, for example, if you're doing a jab versus a hook versus an uppercut, the X and Y's really rotate are fairly different from one gesture to the other. So it's possible that the gestures that I picked were really differentiated enough that the model was easily trained and essentially was getting accuracies of 100%. So then the next thought was, well, how can I maybe make this a little harder for the model? What parameters should I tweak? Am I using too many, is the model too wide? Is it too deep? And so I started tweaking with this a little bit. And so I think this is the end, the one that I did the last, which is 10 units on the first hidden layer, 60, and then I actually removed the second layer altogether, and I ended up with essentially these results here. So I'm doing batches of 50. Originally I had 100 epochs, now I had 50, and these are the results that we're getting. Like you can see them here. It starts out pretty high actually, around 97%, and we end up around 97.14%. And then I compared it to the validation, and you see that the validation is a little below that, but it's still pretty high. And then we have a nice trend here with the learning.
Nice.
Going back to the slide to finish. Okay. So this is the first model that I had, with the 100 nodes at the first layer, 64 on the other one. And like I said, that one went to 100%, pretty quickly. So which essentially surprised me. But like I said, it's possible that the gestures were differentiated enough that it was very easy for the model to pick it up. And then, so next steps. So one of the things I'm going to try is I'm going to try and increase the number of samples, because I did 50 to 55 samples for each gestures, which is actually a lot if you're doing it yourself, if you're collecting the information. But potentially, for a deep learning model, that maybe that's a small number of data. So I'm going to try and increase the number of samples. Maybe try to get other people to provide me some samples, so that it's not just me. It's not learning how I punch or how I do these gestures. The other thing, which is the missing component that I didn't get to, was to do the real-time gesture prediction. So ultimately, I'd like to be able to do the motion in real time and see the model actually confirm what it's seeing. The other thing, which is actually, when I first asked Tyler, about the project, about the capstone, the idea that I had was to actually capture the data, convert them into spectrograms, images. So this spectrogram is essentially a snapshot of the data that shows you the frequency, content, and the timing at the same time. So, usually what we looked at so far were essentially time domain data. We could have looked at frequency domain data by doing a Fourier transform. And then a spectrogram gives you a frequency and time at the same time. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that people are looking into this. Some people have actually implemented using spectrogram images to capture accelerometer data or IMU data, and then essentially train those on CNNs. Right. And I didn't go that far. I'm still going to do it because I think it's an interesting problem to look at. But given the results that I got and how quickly and easily the model was able to predict, get a pretty good accuracy, I'm not sure if it's going to be a good use of resources to convert to images and do the classification. But I'll do it anyway, just to see. And then the other thing I'm planning to do is to shrink the hardware. And obviously, probably many people on the call here know that this is not new space. There are devices like, for example, the Mayo armband, which captures not only IMU data but also nerve impulses. So you can actually tell, which finger you're raising, or what you're doing with your fingers, what you're doing with your hands, etc. And then the other idea is to use a wristwatch that has a IMU inside, accelerometer and gyroscope, as well as Bluetooth, mounted directly on your wrist in order to capture the gestures. So that's what I have for now. In conclusion, I basically ended up spending a lot of time with the data, which I think was part of the course, but I would have liked to spend more time on deep learning and exploring different things. But all in all, I'm satisfied.
Do we have any questions?
So you converted your data. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. It wasn't a question. It was a comment.
You can still go ahead.
I was just saying it was a good project. Good project. Sorry, man.
Thank you.
After you.
So when we looked at that data set that you converted and you had X1, X2, X3, did that correspond to time intervals and an X coordinate at a certain time?
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question. So basically, and this is one of the problems that I was asking Tyler before, is if you have data that is time-based, is it best to use some kind of LSTM or some other RNN model, or could I just feed different time samples to the model? And that's what it ended up doing. So the 64 samples that I have for X, the 64 that I have for Y, and 64 for Z are fed into the model. So that's 192 inputs going into the model. And those are essentially at discrete times. So they're corresponding, right? Like X1 and Y1 and Z1 are the same sample, essentially. X2, Y2, Z2, the same sample, etc. But it ended up working. I'll probably spend a little more time doing some analysis as to exactly how it worked and why it works so fast. But that did work.
Another thing you might try that'll work, I think, pretty well would be one-dimensional convolutions for this. So you'll have each block will be all three XYZ, and you'll have a 1x3 kernel. So you'll look at XYZ, 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 XYZ in a convolutional manner, but just across a flat one-dimensional space. That might work pretty well too.
Great, I'll definitely try that. Thank you.
Okay, so Stephen, you're up next, and Nick, you're on deck. It's already 12:24, and we've got 5 more folks to go. So, and I probably should have been a little tighter on some of you earlier, folks, but try to go fast-ish.
Okay, I will. So I'm sharing my screen. You guys see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as we talked about in the class, I kind of got sucked into the rabbit hole of trying to build some programmatic tools to make it easier to evaluate models. I got started on this when I was trying to apply some of the models to a different data set. And in searching, I found this TensorFlow data set. The module or set of programming components that just, I think, has been recently released, and they're certainly building it up. And the idea is that you can just go to TensorFlow and use a API programming component, download a data set. So I wanted to download a couple different image data sets and try them out. So we were starting on that MNIST data, and I thought, well, I'm really curious what happens with something that's a color picture, and I want to see how these models work. So I want to look for a data set So I started exploring this, and that turned out to be, as is always the case with data, we've heard it here a couple times, a bigger challenge than it seems on the surface, even with pre-prepared data sets that are supposed to be plug and play. I put quite a bit of work into building a wrapper that sits around this API to be able to handle different data sets. I am going to probably write a blog post about this and make this available on Colab, this notebook, perhaps GitHub, so folks can take a look. But I'm not going to spend time here going into the wrapper that I wrote to handle that data because I want to spend more of the time on this TensorBoard. But if you're interested in it, you can take a look. It turned out to be quite a bit of code. If you look here, you can see I wrote quite a bit of code to pretty well documented too to handle that. So, but we don't have much time to go into it. So then, so the objective here is to, as I said, build a pipeline that allows the data scientists to quickly evaluate different models. So step one is being able to pull in data, and here we're using the TensorFlow data set for that. Step two is to run it through an algorithm or a model building function that builds the model, does the fitting, generates the statistics, and then you want to review those. I discovered this TensorBoard thing, which is pretty new, and also useful, but not the easiest thing to get up and running, at least if you want it to be really in a really efficient way to look at your results. So what I got working was the same model applied to the MNIST data set and the malaria data set. And what I can do is just change these parameters here. So the last run I did was this malaria data set. We'll take a look at it. The one I did prior was the MNIST. All I have to do is change these inputs to essentially comment these out and comment these, and then run the notebook. What it does is it downloads the data. There's a whole bunch of information that you can extract about the data. So here's an example of this particular data set and some of the information that's provided when you download it. And then create some logs for the TensorBoard. It then runs through the modeling steps, just as we've done in class, and then it outputs stuff to this framework here, which is the TensorBoard. And I want to spend a couple of seconds talking about this. So what this does is every time you run through your various model tests, whether it's a different model, a different data set, a different set of hyperparameters, whatever you're measuring and experimenting with, if you set it up correctly, you create these logs. The logs then are a record of what you did, and then there's a pretty handy dashboard for viewing this. So in our case, I ran the same model against the MNIST data set and this malaria data set. One of the things that you can do that's kind of handy is you can you can have it write samples of what your data sets look like. So in this case, I'll show this up. This is some examples of my malaria data set. And here we have this, the two class problem where it's infected or uninfected. And then here's the MNIST data set that we've seen before. So this is kind of a nice way to take a look at the sample, at some examples of your images. You also have the accuracy charts that we've been looking at. So in the case, this worked really well on MNIST, this model. It worked pretty poorly on this classification problem for the malaria data set. Could be related to that activation function, because I'm using ReLU here. So if I wanted to check leaky ReLU, I've just run up, change something up top, hit the button, and it should download the whole full set of the model evaluation into this dashboard, and then I can compare it. One of the other things you can do is you can set up, let's take a look at this one first. You can dump images at each epoch at whatever kind of metric you're looking at. So this is kind of cool because in this case, you can scroll through the confusion matrix at each epoch. And you can see how it's changing after each training run. You can then also compare it to the second data set that I applied this model to. In this case, it's not working at all. It's predicting, it's 100% of its, the predictions are parasitized cells. And so in this case, it's pretty clear that it's not working. It's quite obvious, but when you have a little more subtle, then you can set up some cool metrics to kind of see how things are progressing over time. You can also take a look at your models. And so these graphs give you another visual representation of the model. So here's the same model that I'm applying to those two data sets. There's a couple other things that you can take a look at related to the weights at each one of the epochs. So in this case, I'm outputting this stuff at each epoch. And so you can see how some of these variables are changing. So I think that what I found is it is a pretty useful tool. It does take some programming work to get it set up. It's kind of easy to get a really simple example working. It's more challenging to get something more complex. But if you are playing around with a lot of models and you're trying to iterate, it could be a useful way to evaluate the progress of those experimentation. So with that, considering the time, I'll just kind of turn it over to questions.
That's awesome. I really like that thing.
Hey, Steven. Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, I'll go. Is this, so it looks like it's embedded into Jupyter. Does it have to be? Could we make this some sort of like website, internal website that could run things like real time? Does that make sense?
I think so. I thought I saw in the documentation a way to run this outside of a notebook. In this case, I used it in both Jupyter and Colab notebooks, but I believe you can get it to run outside of a notebook. I think there's a command line tool to run it as well. Google has something called tensorboard.dev, which is a way to share your tensor boards with other folks. So if you wanted to then probably present it on a website, you could probably figure out a way to do it, but I didn't play around with that part of it.
That's cool. Yeah, make sure you share your link to your document when you're done, your blog post. Be awesome. Thanks, man.
Sweet. All right, Nick, you're up next. Luke, you're on deck.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Okay, hopefully you can see my desktop, guys. Let me just get myself orientated. Okay, yeah, so a couple of other people have done a slide deck. Obviously this is my capstone project. Okay, so my challenge was to create and train a trading agent, that's rewarded for making positive profit and loss trades, essentially. To do this, I needed to extend the OpenAI gym and basically to create a new AI environment in Python. So I'm going to just change the size of my screen. Okay, so I had to use Keras and TensorFlow, and I used this double deep Q-learning network to process stock prices. The model was based initially on obviously not my own idea, some trading environments, and the lunar lander, which is in the GitHub page that we all have access to, that Tyler's been working on. And for those that may not have seen it, it's here's a little example of it. And it's not going to do anything on my screen. Why is that? Oh, let's try this one. There. It's annoying. I'm going to load it again. Okay, yeah, so when it starts off, it's pretty poor at trying to correct its motion, its downward motion. You go through a training process, it starts improving, it's trying to get between the flags, and it doesn't really do very well until we get right down to the bottom, where it's really still learning. Oh, there we go, that one's really blown it. But you get the impression. So it's a loop back process. Okay, so what went wrong for me? Okay, data. I spent an inordinate amount of time on data, getting it, shaping it. I used Quandel, if that's pronounced correctly, to retrieve basically 1.5 million rows of US stock data. I used TensorFlow 2, which also caused me some problems. It seemed to be some clashes with Keras. I did find a workaround in the end. And I still have a problem where essentially I've picked out one stock, which is Apple. So I have a daily stock price for about 10 years. At the moment, I'm only able to load 1,200 days worth of that data. My process fails. I'm not quite clear why at this point in time, but investigating that further. And I also had problems loading data via HDFS, and I reverted to CSV in the end. Okay, so what did I learn? I learned how to create an RL environment using OpenAI Gym, which is done in a separate file. Let me just show you that quickly. Okay, so a separate Python implementation. This is an MIT, as you can see, implementation which I've leveraged, which goes through some standard functions, which it's expecting. So essentially loading the data, pre-processing that data. Here we go. Yeah, pre-processing data, and then going through some other steps. And so essentially it's all there. So I needed to load that and make it available. Yeah, so my Python skills need improving. I've signed on to Tyler's course, you'll probably be thrilled to know, to improve on that. And then longer term, I need to think about where I'm going with it. So just to give you some more information, the trading rules are set up. You can either buy and invest capital, you can be flat and hold cash only, or you can short sell the stock. Now, this is the results set coming from the people who wrote the model that I've essentially copied. As you can see, and I'm sorry, my screen is quite small, but essentially it starts low, minus 20%. So the agent is trying to beat the market or improve, and it basically starts doing that, but only after a relatively long period of time. As you can see, my data set, which only went up to 1,200 entries, really didn't improve very much. So I'm hoping to go back and work on that in a bit more detail. And I think that's 6 minutes. So any questions?
So the data set here is just previous price movements, or
Yeah.
Are there other variables that feed in?
Yeah, so let me give an example. So here we go. I think Apple's down here. Anyway, so these are daily price movements over the last 10 or so years. I'll just go to the top. Yeah, so it's the ticker, the date, the stock open, the high for the day, the low, close, volume, etc. So the program primarily takes the close and the volume, looking for indicators as to when to sell or buy. And there's this double deep Q-learning algorithm, which I won't delve into in too much detail, because one, I don't know it in enough detail to explain it, but two, it's quite complex, and it basically rewards taking risks and penalizes when you don't make a good decision effectively.
There are some good pieces of reading on the GitHub page about deep Q learning. I'll send that to the Slack channel.
Yeah. Yeah, so my challenge really was to take that data and to process it, and as you can see, I had to basically take it as I received it, to basically just find the stock that I was interested in this case, Apple. I then needed to manipulate that data for basically just the columns I was interested in, and then start running it through my program.
Sweet.
Through the learning process. Okay, so more work to be done there. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, let's move right along. We're at 43 after. So Luke, you're up next. Ming Ru, you're on deck.
Okay, cool. Let me set up my screen share here. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was working on a data set that I found online at Kaggle of chest x-ray images, and they're basically classified between normal and pneumonia. So whether they have a viral or a bacterial infection, but they're all kind of lumped into pneumonia. And so just to kind of roughly walk you through what I did here, I set everything up to access the data, set up the train, validation, and test folders. Then basically just kind of plot out these images so you can see here's a normal and here's a pneumonia. It's interesting, like looking at the images myself, I can hardly tell what the difference is. Some of them are more obvious than others, but sometimes the difference is very subtle. So I experimented with a number of different configurations. Basically what I ended up doing is a 2-layer convolutional network with 2x2 striding, and then I just flattened that down. These are all kind of commented out. I just flattened that down into 1 layer of a 128, and then did a sigmoid activation function and binary cross-entropy loss function with an atom optimizer. This is like the image data generator portion. I'm not sure why I did this after I set up the model, but I did for fun. So just set up a couple parameters for like how it would generate and perturbate the image. So did like some shearing, some zooming, a little bit of rotation and horizontal flip. Yeah, and then trained it. Oh, it's actually still running. Trained it and got, let's let's evaluate this now. I think the most that I was ever able to get was like 87%, and I tried a bunch of different configurations. This one just ended up at 77%. I did often run into curves that looked like this, where my training data, it was able to learn up to like, 97% pretty quickly, and then my validation not so well. Same with the test data. So yeah, it was kind of interesting experiment. I would have liked to have had more time to kind of experiment with different loss functions and different optimizer functions, but yeah, ultimately I got something that was somewhat working. Let's see, this one, did I do that? Oh yeah, okay. So this one had 77% accuracy, but I think it only ran for like eight or 9 epochs. So yeah, it's pretty simple. Not a whole lot to go over here. But any questions?
Do you know what the Kaggle competition winners had in terms of accuracy?
No, I didn't. I had never, I'm very new to this whole field of work, so I'd never used Kaggle before this. I'm slightly confused about how it works or how to find. I did find someone else's kernel. I'm not sure who it was. I think it might have been one of these two that I used to kind of help me as I constructed my notebook here. This person's saying 96.5. Well, this says 98% accuracy. So I'm sure it can be tightened up quite a bit. Another interesting thing I noticed was that some of the images, maybe if I generate new ones here, some of the images are colored and others are black and white scans. And we're passing it in as something that would randomize there. We're passing it in as three depth images. So we're passing it in as color, but I'm wondering if that might have an effect, because I don't know if if the distribution of color versus black and white images is the same within, say, the normal data set and the Pneumonia set. So that's one thing I was noticing of, like, this could potentially have an unintended learning side effect where maybe the model is slightly learning, like, oh, Pneumonia images are in color more often than the normal images or whatever. So some of the things like that I think would need to be addressed in order to, like, really tighten this up. But yeah.
Love it. Okay, sweet. Mingru, you're up next. Quincy, you're on deck. Quincy will be our last full presentation. I think Harry has a short presentation, and a couple of students who are not finished are going to record presentations and send them to the Slack channel, or people also who couldn't attend this live session. So you'll be seeing a few more presentations over the next week. I think you're muted, Mingru.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Oh, yeah. Yes. So for my capstone project, I aim to build sort of neural network to be able to identify so-called transcription factor binding motifs and the binding intensity. So in human genomes, so allow me to get into a little bit background about what exactly it is. Currently, we are able to understand the cells, the behavior of a cell. Actually, generally, we try to understand the gene expression in the cells. And for example, this a long stretch is the whole genome of human. And per gene, the way how the gene is regulated basically gene is almost like Lego pieces to build a cell. How the amount of gene, how many Legos you need to produce in a cell really determined by a type of protein called transcription factor. Generally, transcription factor bind to a binding site in front of the gene, and the binding can directly control how much this gene need to be produced as a protein. Generally, the stronger the binding is, the more the protein is produced. And the reason understanding this is important is nowadays, actually, scientists found a lot of disease, like for example, sometimes a person is more susceptible to a disease. A lot of times because they have a mutation in this binding site, and that mutation causes a transcription factor binds very tightly, then significantly enhance the production of these particular proteins. And you can imagine if this protein is to enhance cell to proliferate, then you might then this particular cell or this particular person might have a stronger tendency to develop tumor. So that's why the motivation of able to characterize this binding activity is so important. So the way I did is first I collect data. Nowadays, as biologists, we are able to do experiment. For example, each of these graph is actually a diagram of a genome, and each of the peak actually is how many transcription factor binds there. The more, the higher the peak is. And the state-of-art technology actually allow us to know exactly this part of the sequence. So basically, the majority of data wrangling is go to those database to identify human genome, to identify those sequences and the corresponding peak height. So very briefly, the data actually looks like that before feeding into model. I have ATGC, a stretch of ATGCs. The sequence itself is the feature. And each sequence actually have a peak height. So my aim is to build a model that can really map sequence to peak height. And if this model can really successfully doing that, then we can use this model to put in arbitrary sequence found, for example, the upper one is a sequence that found in most human, and the lower one is a sequence that found in a more disease susceptible individuals. We can really quantify how different it is. If, for example, if the bind is much stronger, then it is more prone to a particular disease. So before I start to build model, I think about, there are those sequences probably, I guess one is I can use fully connected ALN to capitulate those sequences. Each sequence has a feature. Or I probably can use CNN to scan through the sequence to get also those sequence or more almost like pixel-like dependency. And from my understanding, transcription factor binding is real depending on a stretch of sequence. So because of that, CNN is probably more makes sense. So actually, the whole project is really inspired by a paper. I actually have the reference here. So a very high overview. Basically, the sequence actually DNA is double-stranded. So on top of it, it only capitulates one strand. Actually, there's a totally opposite strand here, complementary to it. So the real data actually is the two strands of those sequence I extract from the data set. Then because both strands are, both sequences come from a single data point. So they feed into the same convolution layers with shared filters. Then after ReLU activation, then some max or average pooling, then a batch normalize, then feed into fully connected neural network. And basically it's a regression question. So we use this to predict the binding intensity. So that's actually a very high level, exactly what's there. So basically the code, very briefly go through a code of basically some data pre-processing. That's exactly how the data extract from the data set will look like. It annotate the chromosome number and the start and end position. And then by using some data wrangling, mapping into reference human genome